Welcome back, advocates. This is our 17th episode in the Grassroots Advocacy series. So, if you haven't had an opportunity to view episodes 1 through 16, I encourage you to go back and do that so that way you have a more robust or larger picture of the notion of advocacy. Advocacy at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. So, in this episode, what we're going to look at is advocacy at the state level. When the framers of the Constitution sat down to create the initial fundamental laws of our country, they really placed a lot of power and a lot of autonomy at the state level. And some really significant things happen at the state level, even sometimes before they necessarily happen at the federal level. And so you can see that the state level is really important. Now, in the previous episode, something that I wanted to that I didn't cover in the previous episode, but I definitely want to make sure to follow up on in here is I mentioned that in the previous episode, I mentioned that it's really good to research candidates, whether they're candidates for the mayor's office, or they're candidates for council member seats, or whatever the case may be. It's really important to interview, to really investigate and do your research about those folks. I also gave the example of the 2016 election period when I went and looked at candidates on both sides of the aisle. Now, what I wanted to mention in this episode that I didn't mention in the previous episode is this. It's really important, even if somebody isn't, even if a candidate is not somebody that you would traditionally vote for, let's say that they're a Republican and you're a Democrat, or let's say that they are a Democrat and you're typically a Republican, I encourage you not to exclude those people out of your research because it can be very helpful to know what the other side is thinking in a manner of speaking. The other thing is, I will share for myself, I am a registered Democrat. However, in the general election, I don't vote a straight party ticket. I do my research and I vote for the person for each of the respective offices that makes the best sense given what I see as important issues. So I wanted to just kind of reinforce that as we get ready to move into the content for this segment. In this segment, or this episode, we are going to look at state level advocacy, and we're going to look at funding. We're going to look at legislation or regulation, and we're going to look at policy. So I'd like to start out by talking to you about the funding piece. Now, when it comes to the state level, the state has a significant role to play in reimbursement as it relates to Medicaid. Now, some states, not all states, have exactly the same Medicaid reimbursement rate. In fact, you can go and you can do research. You can Google it, and you can see that there's actually a pretty wide range of reimbursement rates. Like if you went to go look at the great state of Oklahoma to see what their Medicaid reimbursement rate is, in general terms, the Medicaid reimbursement rate is $146 a day. Now, they also have what is generally referred to as a provider tax. And that means that $11 out of that $146 goes back to the state. And I can't say for absolute certain what they do with those dollars. I just know that they go back. So what that means in practical terms is that the center is reimbursed at even a lower rate than the 146 because if you look at the provider tax. So the state has, as one of its major funding aspects, they fund Medicaid. And now Medicaid is it's a state program that receives federal matching funds. And those matching funds depend on a couple of different variables. But it's really important to understand the funding piece and how it will affect the men and women that you care for. Early in my career with NACA, I had the opportunity to listen to Lori doing a presentation. And it was the first time Lori Porter, who's our chief executive officer and co-founder, she did a presentation, and she really provided me with a very easy to understand way of thinking about this. So let's use our friends down in the great state of Oklahoma as an example. So let's start out with $146. Now, I want you to get out your calculator. We'll start out with 146, and now we're going to start subtracting. Okay, the first thing that we have to subtract is our lodging for a 24-hour period. Well, in general terms, you could find a decent place to stay for about $90 a day. So go ahead and take that $90 off. Then let's think about food. Now, if you don't want to eat at McDonald's 3 times a day, let's say you want to eat at McDonald's maybe for lunch, and you want to eat at Waffle House for breakfast, and you want to eat at Golden Corral for dinner. If you add those 3 meals together, you're talking about roughly $40. So if you add that $90 and that $40, that gives you how much? $130, right? So that means we have $16 left. Is that correct? So now then, you have to use that $16 for entertainment. You have to use that $16 to get somebody to come and visit you every 2 hours. In my center, we called it tea time, turning towel and toileting. But you have to get somebody to come check on you every 2 hours. So that's 12 visits in a 24-hour period, right? To check on me to make sure I'm still alive and kicking and I'm comfortable. You also have to be able to use that $16 to have snacks and to have somebody bring you by drinks and things like that. Now, is it realistic with that $146 to think that that $146 covers everything that we do for the women and men that we care for on a daily basis? Is that realistic? If you couldn't do that, or I couldn't do that for $146, what makes us think that the long-term care setting is going to be able to do that for $146? So what I encourage you to do as a grassroots advocate at the state level is to pay attention to how your state manages and administers Medicaid. And if your state discusses decreasing Medicaid funding, I encourage you to speak up. I encourage you to speak up on behalf of your elders first and foremost. And then I encourage you to speak up on behalf of your profession, the post-acute and long-term care environments. Because when Medicaid is cut, it actually has the potential to cause centers to have to close. So thinking about that funding is really important. The next thing that I'd like to ask you to think about is legislation. Legislation can take on a variety of different forms. For example, I mentioned in a previous episode that we had just gotten through the primary season. And one of the items that was on the primary ballot for this year was a proposition, I think it was Prop A, and it was a right to work legislation. And so it was interesting because I heard about it in a couple of commercials on the local TV channels. And then I actually went to do research. And what I found for myself was that I wasn't able to support that piece of legislation. In other words, I wasn't able to vote yes, I voted no, because based on my understanding, I didn't believe it was in the best interest of Missourians or in my own personal best interest, so I voted no. So it's really important to look at the legislation that's happening in your state, and especially as it relates to aging services or elder care or elder abuse or any of those sorts of things that impact the men and women that we care for in our communities. Really taking the opportunity to become educated about what's going on as far as laws are concerned. The next thing that I wanted to touch on at the state level is looking at policies. I remember in the very early 90s in the state of Missouri, there was a policy that said that all mental health settings that were run by the state would be closed. Now, on the face of it, when I very first heard that, I thought, wow, that's really cool. Because I really wasn't a big fan of state hospitals because it created this institutional problem. Now, I have a slightly different way of thinking about it because a number of the men and women that were receiving care in institutions, mental health institutions, are now becoming residents in long-term care environments. And it's bringing a set of effects or impacts that we hadn't necessarily anticipated or adequately prepared for. So it's really important when you're thinking about advocacy at the state level to take the time to understand the policies. And not only understanding the policies, but also taking the time to understand how those policies will impact you as a caregiver, the men and women that you care for, and your community at large. Taking the time to really think about it. Like I said, when they first said in the early 90s, we're going to close all the mental health hospitals, I thought that was a good idea. Well, where I messed up was I didn't take the time to stop and think about what that meant in the bigger picture. So really take the time to analyze those policies to see how they're going to affect us. Now, I really appreciate that you've shared your time with me today. Again, I want to encourage you, if you haven't already seen episodes 1 through 16, please go back and look at them. I also want to invite you back to our next episode where we're going to continue discussion of advocacy, and we're going to be looking at advocacy more on the federal level. And so until next time, let's close with this quote from Thomas Jefferson. Do you want to know who you are? Don't ask, act. Action will delineate and define you. What will your actions be? Until next time.